if you take the risk of having a storm towards the end of the century that would, or the risk that you would have a severe weather impact, the consequences, if you risk weight all of that, it's $1.4 billion. So that would be the amount of damage that we would be expected to have on an annual basis towards the end of the century, against a $3.1 billion budget that the city of Boston has right now. So the scope of the challenge here is certainly immense.
Austin Blackmon is the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. He has departments ranging from Parks and Rec, the environment, and also investigational. That's not quite right. What's the last one? Thank you. Inspectional services reporting into him. And his mission is to make Boston a more resilient and climate-ready city, while also really improving the quality of life for all the residents of the city. So that's a very big job. Since 1991, there have been 21 events that have triggered federal or state disaster declarations for the city of Boston. And so this is an issue that's been with us, but we know that it will only grow as climate change continues to have an impact and as weather-related effects become more severe over time. The challenges are very complex and grand. We need bold and creative solutions to be prepared for what climate change is going to bring us, and to continue to enjoy a Boston that is vibrant and livable. So let me move on to say that in addition to overseeing climate readiness programs in Boston, we also are going to hear tonight about Austin Blackmon's efforts to keep Boston a national leader in energy policy, which obviously is closely linked to climate change. Prior to joining the Walsh administration in 2014, Chief Blackmon was interim head of project finance for Terra Verde Renewable Partners. He's also had many other roles, which I think prepared him perfectly for the one he's serving in today. He was in consulting at Booz Allen and Hamilton Strategy and Operations Group. He was involved in energy investment banking at Wells Fargo Securities, in business development at C12 Energy, and was also involved in advising the U.S. Renewables Group. He hails from the Great Lakes region, but has been in this area for 11 years, including as a student at Harvard University and at Harvard Business School. So we feel very honored to have you here tonight. We're very grateful for the work you're doing on behalf of our city and all of us. I'd like to welcome Austin Blackmon, our speaker for tonight.
The City of Boston launched Carbon Free Boston. This is an analysis, thank you. This is an analysis that's going to help the City of Boston understand what actions and policies it will have to put into place in order to hit our carbon neutrality goal by 2050. It's something that we've been working on for a long time in partnership with the Green Ribbon Commission and a team over at Boston University. So very, very pleased to say that. Much better circumstances to be talking to you all tonight. So I always start out these presentations by asking a question. Who here is from the city of Boston? Quick raise of hands. Okay, so almost everyone. Now, most people who live in Boston don't realize that about a third of Boston is actually reclaimed land. Boston used to be swampy, tidelands, and basically our predecessors decided that if the city of Boston was going to continue to grow, that they needed to fill that in. And they were smart about it. They recognized where the highest high tide came at that point, and they made those filled in lands just a little bit higher. However, over the past 100 years or so, we've measured the tide in Boston Harbor, and we've seen that about every 10 years it's gone up by an inch. And we're projecting that to get happen much more quickly. And so as a result, Boston is one of the top 5 most vulnerable cities to climate change. You can just see it that on the map behind me, the outlines of Logan Airport, that all used to be ocean. Big parts of the seaport of Back Bay and even parts of downtown were in the water. And as sea levels continue to rise, all those areas become very, very vulnerable. And so Mayor Walsh, who's very, very passionate not only about climate change, but also about making data-driven decisions, tasked us with taking all of the best data available and understanding where in Boston are we most vulnerable to climate change, and understand what we can do from a project perspective to adapt to these changes, but then also what can we do through Carbon-Free Boston to make sure that we're reducing emissions as much as possible. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But here's some of what we learned from Climate Ready Boston, this vulnerability analysis to help us understand where we need to take action. These are our projections for the FEMA floodplain in the near term, so 2030s or so, about 9 inches. You can see that the shaded areas of blue in East Boston and South Boston and parts of downtown. That's where we're predicting that the FEMA floodplain will be. You can see that by mid-century, those areas are significantly larger. More than 25% of East Boston and South Boston now fall within the FEMA floodplain. And then if you look towards the end of the century, where we're expecting 3 feet of sea level rise, you can see that entry points from Fort Point Channel in South Boston, Dorchester, come together and cover the majority of even the south end. Obviously, catastrophic consequences as a result of that level of sea level rise. Here's another point to make, though. We based that on the most likely outcomes based on the data that we saw. So most likely 3 feet of sea level rise towards the end of the century. But if you look at that scope between 2.4 and 7.4 feet worth of sea level rise, that is the likely outcomes, not just the most likely outcome. So who knows what drives sea level rise? You can shout it out. Greenhouse gas emissions. I heard it back in the corner over there.
Ice sheets melting.
And so the reason why that projection is so wide is because we don't know what greenhouse gas emissions are going to look like between now and the end of the century. If we do a really, really great job of reducing our impact on the environment and reducing emissions, then we could be in a scenario where we only would expect about 2.5 feet of sea level rise. However, if we don't do a good job, then we could have as much as 7.4 feet of sea level rise. And for those of you who said you were from Boston, you recognize Kevin Garnett. I've had a chance to see Kevin Garnett in person, and you look like this to actually make eye contact with him. He's 6'11" or 6.9 feet tall. And the amount of sea level rise that we could get might even be taller than him. But sea level rise isn't the only issue that we would be facing. Now, again, a lot of you who said that you were from Boston, you said that you probably go to vacation either down on Cape Cod, or maybe some of you go up to Vermont or Maine. How many people have gone to vacation over the summer in Birmingham, Alabama? Just me. I was a small town called Rettenberg where my grandfather grew up. It's not a phenomenally pleasant climate to be in. But if we don't do anything, we are on pace to have a climate in Boston by the end of the century that is more similar to Birmingham, Alabama than anywhere else. 90 days of 90-degree temperatures or above. That has severe consequences for our population here, particularly our seniors, particularly our student athletes who want to spend time outdoors. We would have to start telling them to spend more time inside. We would have profound impacts on the amount of electricity that we would need for the increased demand that we would have for air conditioning. And beyond all of that, if you have an illness that is induced or exacerbated by heat, like heart disease, lung disease, diabetes. Probably if I asked everyone in this room, you probably know somebody that has one of those 3 things. If we had this type of increase in temperature in the city of Boston, people with any of those heat exacerbated illnesses would be 3 times more likely to have a heat related fatality. So again, a staggering impact that we have to try and prevent. I mentioned that Mayor Walsh is really passionate about data. So he wanted us to take all of this data and put it into dollars and cents, help us understand what's at risk from a productivity standpoint, from the assets that are in the city of Boston and what they're worth, to give us a sense, how much should we be willing to invest to protect the city of Boston? And what we learned is by the end of the century, we'll have over 12,000 buildings that will be in the FEMA floodplain, worth over $85 billion. Now, just to kind of put that in context, all of the city of Boston's operations, so our police, our fire, our schools, EMS, all of our public sanitation, public works, transportation, that's $3.1 billion that we spend each year. If you take the risk of having a storm towards the end of the century that would, or the risk that you would have a severe weather impact, the consequences, if you risk weight all of that, it's $1.4 billion. So that would be the amount of damage that we would be expected to have on an annual basis towards the end of the century against a $3.1 billion budget that the city of Boston has right now. So the scope of the challenge here is certainly immense. And this is another really important takeaway. If you look at that $1.4 billion I was talking about, it's really driven not by some of the most cataclysmic storms that you could imagine, the 0.1% storm or even the 1% storm. When you take into account how much more frequently you would have the 10% storm, that's what really drives these numbers. So the damage that you could expect by the end of the century from a storm that you could expect pretty frequently is even pretty cataclysmic, almost $1 billion worth of damage that you could expect. I show this picture because I talk a lot about, oh, the end of the century, right? But a lot of these challenges are happening right now. You can see in the top left corner, that's a picture that is very close to where we are right now on Long Wharf. That's daytime flooding from king tide. The ocean already coming above where it was intended to be. We're seeing more of our students and children coming into our hospitals suffering from asthma, likely caused by air pollution. I'm sure all of us are very familiar with the congestion and the traffic that we have here on the streets of Boston. And for those of you who were here during the blizzards of 2015, you know how that severe weather shut our city down. Our transportation system totally ground to a halt. That was my third week on the job. I learned a lot. Great stories for those who want to hear those afterwards. But the point is that mayors understand this because their residents talk about it already. They understand that they have to start working on these climate issues, and that's why not only are we taking action here in the city of Boston, but we're making sure that we're helping mayors across the country and across the globe, frankly, through international work that we do with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, through the C40 cities, through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, through climate mayors. We want to make sure that we are helping any mayor that wants to take the first action of making a climate action plan, hiring their first chief sustainability officer, doing a greenhouse gas inventory. We want to make sure that they learn from our mistakes because we know that mayors are facing these challenges right now and that they will need help to provide these services to their constituents. So what are we doing to make sure that we can be climate ready here in the city of Boston? These are the 5 main areas. We have to make sure that it's great that we did the analysis once on the vulnerability study, but as I mentioned, as those greenhouse gas numbers come in on a year-to-year basis, we're going to have to recalibrate and understand whether we need to prepare for 2.5 feet or 7.5 feet worth of sea level rise. We also have to take some action in terms of protecting our shoreline and make sure that those coastal storms aren't going to cause the levels of damage that we're projecting. Our infrastructure has to be more resilient, make sure that severe storms won't impact it as well. And our buildings have to be ready for some of these impacts as well. And lastly, through forums like this, and from you going out and talking to your friends and to your family about what the city of Boston is doing, we have to make sure that everyone is aware not only of the scope of the challenges, but what they can do in order to have the impacts, protect themselves, and protect their neighbors. So I'll go just into a little bit more detail in terms of on a handful of these. So on resilient infrastructure, You can imagine in the city of Boston, since we are an old city, we've got so much infrastructure that's already in the ground, whether that's our electric utilities, whether that's the tunnels that we use to get over to East Boston, whether it's the tunnels that we use for our MBTA and our subway system. Tons of infrastructure that's layered on top of each other. And you can imagine a scenario where you've got a water pipe that starts leaking underground. That water pipe leaks onto a steam pipe, and that steam pipe creates this pressure that then creates a fissure in the road that's above it. Now all of a sudden you have a flood entry pathway that goes all the way down into an MBTA tunnel. It's these overlapping challenges that are very, very difficult for one individual agency to plan for. And so as we did Climate Ready Boston, we made sure that we had Eversource, that we had National Grid, that we had Veolia, the steam utility, that we had the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, that we had MassDOT, all come together, tell us what their challenges were, and then work together to understand how we could work together in the future, to make sure that they came up with design standards as they're making improvements to their infrastructure that will make the system as a whole more resilient. This is work that we are just kicking off, but it is critically important. We make the city of Boston climate ready. I mentioned adapted buildings. I really want to focus on this for a few minutes as well. Many of you will recognize the Spaulding Rehabilitational Hospital. This is a place where many of the Boston Marathon victims went to learn how to walk again. This is a hospital that specializes on folks who have mobility challenges. And they learned the lesson as they were designing and constructing this building from hospitals in New Orleans and New York who had to suffer through the challenges of Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy. And so they wanted to make sure they built a resilient building. And despite the fact that it is surrounded, you can just barely make out some of the water there, it's surrounded by the FEMA floodplain. And so they took all of the critical mechanicals in the building and put it on the roof. They've got a small power and heat plant on the roof as well, and 72 hours worth of fuel on site at all times. So if the electric grid goes out, they can start that up and they can provide heat and electricity to the entire building. They can also open their windows from the second floor in case open the windows on the second floor in case they need to provide ventilation or do an evacuation from the second floor if they're totally flooded out on the first floor. And all of this is because of the use case for this building. It's critical infrastructure. They can't have their patients in the FEMA floodplain. They have to be located on the second floor or above. Now, do we need this level of resiliency for every building in the city of Boston? Absolutely not. Take, for instance, a building in the Seaport that's really just all office buildings, where most people who come to work there can telework for 72 hours. Maybe that building only needs to be able to get back to normal 72 hours later, and in the meantime, it doesn't need to be online. What we're doing in the city of Boston, working in partnership with the Boston Planning and Development Agency, is to make sure that we're coming up with smart zoning standards so that if somebody wants to build a building like the Spaulding Rehabilitational Hospital, that they're held to a very, very high standard, but not necessarily every single building in the city of Boston at that level. We're also looking at how we can protect our shores. And we have kicked off work in East Boston and Charlestown to understand what shovel-ready projects we can put into place to protect those neighborhoods. That analysis, which we recently completed, has already led to an investment by the city of Boston of $2 million to protect those two neighborhoods. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. South Boston is ongoing work right now. We're coming up with those shovel-ready projects, a much bigger challenge in South Boston because of the number of flood entry pathways. We're also in the process of kicking off work in Dorchester in the South Boston border for the Moakley Park. You can see on this slide that is a huge opportunity to use our open space as a barrier to then protect not only Dorchester, South Boston, but also the South End and parts of even the Back Bay. To go into a little bit more detail on the work that we did in East Boston, you can see that even right now, the current 1% storm provides a flood entry pathway that goes all the way down the East Boston Greenway. But as time goes on, the challenge gets even greater. And so as we looked at this, we tried to identify places where we could have projects that would protect the city of Boston. And we came up with a long-term vision for this entire shoreline, leveraging not only the opportunities that we have through the development cycle and having buildings that are integrated into this plan, but then also activities that we could take on our own as the city of Boston to protect these neighborhoods. So one of those projects is the flood wall that you can see, that red line towards the southern, well, not the southern, but the bottom of the screen here of the East Boston Greenway. That'll actually provide protection from that current 1% annual flood risk, and it can do so for under $500,000. A phenomenal project that'll help protect over 4,500 residents in the city of Boston and about 100 businesses. So we're very, very proud to have announced that project as a result of the work that we've done on Climate Ready Boston. It's a little bit difficult to make out from this angle, but this is Charlestown in the Sullivan Square area. That current flood risk site, and where you see the arrows coming in, is right by the Schrafft's building, if people are familiar with that, and the Ryan Playground just next door to it. As you can see, a relatively narrow flood entry pathway, very similar to what you saw in East Boston as well, just a handful of locations where you can have water come in, but then once it gets in, it spreads out pretty quickly and has impacts across broad swaths of the neighborhood. So again, through this work, we identified a long-term vision for this area where we could add open space and berms. But in the meantime, we identified that just by raising Main Street, just off the side of Sullivan Square, we could provide significant protection not only to Boston, but also to our neighbors in Cambridge as well. And so as part of the redesign of Sullivan Square and an existing capital project, we'll be elevating Main Street by 2 feet to provide protection to that neighborhood as we continue to work with the multiple different property owners on a plan to provide that additional open space along the water's edge, both here in Charlestown as well as East Boston. So the ongoing work in South Boston is going to be more challenging. Whereas you saw in East Boston and Charlestown, just a handful of flood entry pathways, relatively small and easy to block. In the seaport, the water comes in basically from everywhere. Much bigger challenge, but we're already starting to see ideas and ways that we might be able to protect South Boston. GE, that site is highlighted by the yellow circle. They, for instance, as part of the development cycle, took it upon themselves to do the right thing. As they build their building, they're actually raising up the entire site and providing something that could connect into a broader strategy of protecting the seaport and the Fort Point Channel area, which is a major pathway further in the future. So opportunities like that, leveraging the development cycle and proposals for these buildings as they're being reviewed by the Boston Planning Development Agency as well as the Environment Department, are opportunities that we see to integrate into our broader protection strategy. Of course, this is what everybody loves to talk about, the harbor barrier. This is a graphic that shows a couple of different options that if we wanted to, we could consider in terms of protecting not only the neighborhoods in Boston that are vulnerable, but potentially even some of our neighbors as well. So there are a handful of proposals that you can see on the screen behind me. The smallest being one that connects Logan Airport down to Castle Island in South Boston. Another option would be to go a little bit further out, so protecting the city of Boston in a broader harbor by connecting Deer Island to Long Island down in through Quincy. And then the farthest out would then be connecting Deer Island to Lovell's Island all the way out to Hull. Now, as we look at this, and UMass Boston is leading a feasibility study on this right now, it's not just about the dollars and cents and how expensive this would be. About 10 years ago, somebody did a study and thought that you could do this for about $10 billion. That's a lot of money. But beyond just how expensive this is, you have to take into account that Boston has a very, very economically driven marine economy. And if you put in a barrier like this, what impact does that have? What impact does that have on the investment that we've made to allow larger ships to get in and out of our ports and move goods in a more efficient manner? What impact does that have on the literally billions of dollars that we've spent trying to clean up Boston Harbor? What does it do to the ecology if you no longer have that tidal flushing in and out every day? So it's not just how do we protect the city of Boston, but what does this do to our economy? What does this do to the ecology and the investments that we've made to improve all of those? So I've talked a lot about adaptation. I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon-free Boston and what we're trying to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions here in the city of Boston. As Mayor Walsh has made it very clear, this is a major priority for him. And as I mentioned before, very proud that today we launched Carbon-Free Boston. If you want more information on that, take a look at my Twitter feed, Austin F as in Frederick Blackmon, and you'll see the articles that we have been written, the press release that we did, and all the detail that you would want to hear on what we have planned for this initiative. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this is an analysis that helps us understand what's on the menu. What are the different things that Boston could potentially do to get to carbon neutral? What are the costs and the benefits of each one so that as we update our next climate action plan, we can take that into account. And more importantly, we can give that information to all of you, to our residents, to our businesses. And as we get that feedback from you, you say, hey, we really like this idea and we're not so hot on that. Then we can have an engaged, informed discussion about what the city of Boston should do next. So this is a short list of a couple of the areas that we will be studying. We've brought a team on board that's going to do models in 4 major areas, and here are the first 2, energy and buildings. So on the energy perspective, we're going to look at how cost-effective a community choice aggregation would be. Is everybody familiar with a community choice aggregation? Raise a hand. All right, so right now, when you pay your electric bill, if you're a Boston resident, you're probably paying Eversource Energy. Eversource's job is to maintain the electric grid, to make sure that they get electricity from a power plant to the socket at your house. What they also do is, on behalf, actually buy the electricity that that power plant creates. And so they'll twice a year say, okay, how much electricity does Boston need? And they'll go out to these electric generators and they will buy it on your behalf. What a community choice aggregation does is it allows cities like Boston to go and buy that electricity on your behalf instead of Eversource. And what Boston could do is add in additional renewables above the bare minimum requirements that Eversource has to hit based on state requirements. And so the city of Boston has just been authorized to do this, and we want to study what the cost impacts would be in order to make our electric supply here in Boston more renewable. That's one thing that we'll look at on the energy side. Carbon pricing, something that is a very hot button issue, but we want to understand what the cost impacts would be and if that's one of the more efficient tools. In the city of Boston, we don't have control over our building code. It's administered by the state, but we want to understand what the cost and the benefits would be if we worked with the state to make modifications to make our buildings more efficient. What if we put forward an ordinance or worked with the state to require energy audits and energy disclosures? These are all policies that could have a huge impact on how we ultimately get to that carbon neutrality goal. Transportation and waste are the other 2 areas that we'll be evaluating and models that we have for both. On the waste side, we also kicked off today our zero waste plan, and we're going to be having our first steering committee meeting on that in January. Boston is doing so much that is great on adaptation and mitigation, and our friends and our peers at the Department of Public Works have done an amazing job to really improve what we've done to recycle and our pilots around composting in the city of Boston. On a good day in Boston, we have about 20% of our waste diverted from landfill. If you look at our peer cities, leaders on climate change, like San Francisco diverts 80%. So we've still got a huge opportunity to catch up and do work there. So we're very, very excited to look at the largest opportunities that we have to reduce waste in the city of Boston. At our last study, we found about 30% of waste in our waste stream was organics, things that could be composted. So that's a huge opportunity for us. Looking at composting programs is going to be a really big opportunity within the waste space. On transportation, so many initiatives, looking at expanding HOV lanes, working with the state to see if we could have policies that would allow hybrids or electric vehicles to have access to those lanes. As you know, many of you, our work on Go Boston 2030, the city's transportation plan, already has extensive planning on how we can improve our bus, our bike, and other infrastructure that allow people to mode shift instead of taking single occupancy vehicles in and out of the city of Boston. And of course, looking at how we administer parking permits and for what cost to incentivize folks to make that transition as well. Mayor Walsh is also really, really passionate about us leading by example. And so we've got a program called the Renew Boston Trust. And this will look at the over 300 buildings that we have in the city of Boston and for our municipal assets and how we can make them more energy efficient. We're engaged in something called an Energy Savings Performance Contract. What this means is we've gone out and we've engaged with a vendor who's going to come in and evaluate a suite of these buildings for us and identify projects that they will guarantee to us will save us more money than it will cost for us to build and the debt service that we would have to pay in order to build it. And if that did not come true, so if our debt service were higher than the savings that we actually realized, they would pay us the difference. So that's the basics of an energy savings performance contract. So as a result, we get to do more projects faster and at the same time save all of our residents money. It's a great opportunity for us to upgrade the existing buildings that we have. We also want to make sure that we empower our businesses and residents to make smart decisions as well. So we did something called the Boston Community Choice Energy Study. And what this is try to identify the best locations in the city of Boston to do distributed generation, whether that's a microgrid or an opportunity to have combined heat and power plants here in the city of Boston. And this is really, really difficult work. You have to take multiple data sets together to really make this happen, to understand where you've got enough load from buildings, whether they're hospitals or office buildings, residential or otherwise, to really have that investment make sense. So we took data that we collect from our Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. This is utility data that the largest buildings in the city of Boston have to provide to us. We took zip code level data from our partners at Eversource and from National Grid on where their loads are coming from. And then we partnered that with our assessing database, which told us what different buildings, what their profiles were. So how many floors were they? How old were some of their heaters? What was the use case of the building? To model building by building in the city of Boston what their energy use looked like. And from there, we identified these areas in the city where you could have distributed generation, district energy, and have the impacts be substantial cost savings, resiliency, and just a much, much more resilient system here in the city of Boston. From that work, one of those areas that we identified was actually the Dorchester Avenue corridor. This is a planning area that the Boston Planning and Development Agency is looking at, and as a result, we started this Boston Smart Utilities work there. This is an opportunity. We recognize that we're going to have to put in about 2 miles of additional roadway. If you're in Boston and you see construction trucks on our roads, frequently that's because you've got one of our utility partners either repairing equipment or going in and installing new equipment. What Boston Smart Utilities is hoping that we can do is we can pre-build those corridors to let communications or other utility connections go into place. So instead of having to tear up the street to access it or to install it, you can put it into a pre-built corridor so you don't have to go through that process. Hopefully we'll be able to do that with district energy and combined heat and power so that you can have that flow from the work that we did on the Boston Community Energy Study and have it inform the Boston Smart Utilities work. I mentioned the community choice aggregation. I just wanted to point out again the scale of the size of this opportunity. So Eversource does that purchasing for something called basic service. Electric use represents about 36% of our greenhouse gas emissions here in the city of Boston. Basic service is about 27% of our electric use. So if you take those two numbers, you multiply it by each other, then you come up with a number that's just under 10%. So if through our community choice aggregation, we went to 100% renewable, we could knock off 10% of our greenhouse gas inventory. That's kind of the scale of the power of this tool. But we also really want to make sure that we're empowering our residents as well. So Renew Boston is a program that we have that helps direct our residents and our businesses towards incentives that are available at the state through a program called Mass Save. You can get incentives on energy efficiency equipment up to 90%. Everyone that lives in the city of Boston can qualify for a free home energy audit. They will come in, they will replace every light bulb in your house with an energy efficient LED. They will give you a report on steps that you can take, whether it's improving your thermal insulation or otherwise, to make your home more energy efficient. We take that information and we make it more tailored to an urban environment. In Boston, we have dozens of spoken languages, so we translate the information into 6 languages. We also have a very high rental population here in the city of Boston, over 60%. The information on the Mass Save website is tailored much more towards ownership population. So we make sure that we have workshops in our rental communities and that we push those communities to take action as well. And then we also want to make sure that we're recognizing particularly those in the business sector, those who have a huge opportunity to realize these reductions and give them the recognition that they deserve. So through a program called the Mayor's Carbon Cup for building owners that have over 1 million square feet in the city of Boston, if they pledge to reduce their emissions by 35%, so even above what the city's goals are, we'll give them this special recognition, we'll give them additional technical assistance, because those are the folks who are really able to drive the reductions in Boston. If you look at our emissions profile, over 50% of it comes from large buildings and institutions. And so this program is really, really targeted towards helping those organizations drive the changes that they need to make. I mentioned the building disclosure ordinance already. That helped us with the Boston Energy Study. But then we also have a really strong tool called Article 37. So any large building in the city of Boston that's being proposed, when it's being reviewed by the Boston Planning and Development Agency, it is also reviewed here at the Environment Department as well. And we look for them being able to demonstrate that not only is the building able to be LEED certified, but also we ask them, how do you plan on protecting your building from climate change based on the projections that we've made into the future? What is your plan to do that? How do you plan to deal with water? How do you plan to deal with urban heat island impacts? This is really, really pioneering work that we've just updated the standards for over the course of the summer. I just want to take a quick moment to thank all of you for coming here tonight. It's really my pleasure to be here to talk to you, but really please, if you take away one thing from tonight, and I'm more than happy to take questions from you all, it's take this message and send it to everybody else. If you can go on to our Green Innovate Boston website, if you can go onto my Twitter feed and send things to your friends and your neighbors, that is the most important thing that we can do. You're here tonight, you've taken your time to come and listen to me speak because you're passionate about these issues. You know that they're a big challenge. My biggest concern is that sometimes I might be preaching to the choir. I need to make sure that all of you take these messages and make sure that your friends and that your family understand the scope of the challenges. We've set up programs called Climate Ready Boston Leaders. If you haven't signed up for it already, sign up. We will teach you how to give this presentation so that you can go and give it to your friends, to your family, to the folks who join you at a house of worship, and make sure that you can put it into their language, literally or figuratively, and so that we can have friends educating friends, neighbors educating neighbors. So, again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It'll be my pleasure to take any questions you may have. Sure, and I'll just repeat the question. It's, have we considered taking any steps to prepare our workforce, either through BPS or otherwise, for the green jobs of the future? And the short answer to that question is yes. And not because it's the green jobs of the future, it's the green jobs of today. So even if you take, for instance, the workforce that manages buildings throughout the city of Boston, a lot of times they're dealing with technology that they weren't trained to use because when they were coming up through the ranks, it didn't exist. And so one thing that we're looking at, and I see Adam Jacobs on my staff who's over there, who's responsible for pushing this program forward, is creating a program that will allow those building managers to get access to training on this new equipment in Boston. Right now, they would have to go all the way out to Lowell to get that type of training. And that's not something that a lot of folks, particularly building managers who are busy people, are able to do, to take that much time to go back and forth to Lowell to get that training. So Adam's working on that. We also have a great partnership with the Boston Public Schools as well, where they have a sustainability coordinator who's embedded into the schools to help work on composting, recycling, and a lot of these issues that we're talking about as well. Just spreading the word and making sure that there's an awareness, because if you get the kids talking about it, the parents will have to listen to it. Right? And so that's certainly something that we see. Creating that next generation of sustainability ambassadors is a really important part of the job, and introducing students to the concept of having a career in the green economy is something that is really important as well. You might be familiar with the Boston Green Academy. Their entire mission is, as they teach students about physics, they're talking about how they could actually have a career in the green economy. So as they're learning about physics, for instance, they design their own wind turbines, and they take a fan and they hold it up and they measure the efficiency of those turbines to get them exposed to the idea of maybe being an engineer, maybe being a wind technician. So the short answer, yes, it's something that we see as a major opportunity. Great question. So the question was that a lot of the buildings in the seaport seem like they're in that FEMA floodplain that's been projected. Did a lot of them take that into account, or will there have to be a lot of renovations? The short answer is a lot of those buildings were there before we did this analysis. Many of them had to go through a process already, though, in terms of demonstrating how they were going to be climate prepared. Are they required to take all of those steps? Unfortunately not. The City of Boston, as part of our municipal charter, we're not able to control our building codes. We're not able to say, you have to build your building this way. That's a power that the state has as a home rule state. So, will there need to be some renovations? Maybe. We'll see. One of the things about the seaport area is that the depth of the flooding is not that bad compared to some of the other areas in Boston, but it's certainly going to be a challenge to just keep that very thriving economic center in the city of Boston going as these challenges become more and more frequent.
carbon neutral Boston plan for 2050. And my question about that is, how as a city do we plan to meet that goal if we're still investing in natural gas pipelines, for example, being this Back Bay pipeline that National Grid has proposed and is going through the approval process? And to follow up with that, are there certain deadlines that we're aiming to meet percentages by certain years before 2050?
Great question. It's how you plan on hitting your carbon neutrality goal if there are still new pipelines being installed in the city of Boston for natural gas. Phenomenal question. And the follow-up question was also then, are there deadlines that are going to be in place as a result where you say that no more natural gas pipelines at some point? The short answer is it's something that we're looking at. We have to understand what the costs and the benefits are, and that's the whole reason why we're going through the analysis. With natural gas, you have to say yes, at some point we're going to have to get off of that, but you also have to look at the progress that we've made so far in terms of the reductions that we've made. More than 2/3 of our emissions reductions in the city of Boston are because of natural gas, because we're using that now instead of using oil or diesel to power and heat our buildings. So it's definitely a bridge fuel because it still is a carbon fuel. However, we do have to understand what that transition looks like, what technologies will be available to us to do that, whether it's using steam infrastructure, right? And that's for the Back Bay pipeline. We hear pretty frequently, oh, well, why don't we connect into the steam infrastructure? Well, the steam infrastructure is powered not only by natural gas, but also diesel as well. And so do you really get a net benefit from having that connection or not? It's hard to say. But the short answer is yes, we have to figure out a way to get off of that. We have to figure out a way to make sure that our buildings, their thermal profile is strong enough so that instead of using natural gas, we can use other technologies that are electrified to heat our buildings. It's a major challenge. We have to understand what all the options are, whether it's through the building code, whether it's through energy efficiency standards, whether it's through a mandate saying no new infrastructure at a certain point. But we have to do this across the entire economy. It's not just going to be our natural gas pipelines. Transportation is going to be a huge challenge. Vehicles miles traveled haven't really substantially decreased despite the fact that greenhouse gas emissions from the electric sector have. So the short answer is yes, we are going to have to deal with the issue. It's something that we want to study, and we'll figure out the best path forward. So I want to make sure I understand, and your question is, why have we chosen to be carbon neutral instead of being just totally carbon free?
Yeah,
from an energy perspective, from an electricity perspective.
Yeah, electricity, sorry.
I don't think that we've necessarily made that designation. The reason why we use the term carbon neutral is because we want to have some flexibility on it using offsets and renewable energy credits to see if that last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% of greenhouse gas emissions that would be extraordinarily costly to get out of our system, it might be more cost effective to use offsets as a solution. So the short answer is, at some point, would we have 100% of our electricity come from renewables? I think it's certainly possible, and through offsets or through renewable energy credits to offset any additional emissions, or if there's technology that will allow us to actually take greenhouse gas emissions out of the air, and we're starting to see that as well. We wanted to make sure that we had the flexibility to allow us to use those tools as well. So the question is, why is San Francisco so far ahead of Boston on diverting waste to landfill? And a couple differences between San Francisco and Boston. Boston's a much older city. Our streets are much more clogged. They're much smaller. Our buildings were built such that they don't have space for 3 bins like they have in San Francisco. So in San Francisco, you'll have not only waste, you'll have recycling, but then also compost, and they have different collections for each of those. And as a result, they've got a phenomenal program. They have very strong enforcement. They have wider streets that allow them to use automated collection in an easier fashion than we do. We also have a very, very high rental population here in the city of Boston. So tools like pay as you throw are a little bit more difficult to do because it's not necessarily tied to who owns the building. Whereas in a suburban setting, or a setting where you've got more of an ownership population, then it's easier to have a tool like that at your disposal. That said, those are just challenges. We are going to now come up with solutions because we have to play catch up. It's an important component of what we do. I'm going to, the question, what role do you see for distributed generation, particularly rooftop solar, in the city of Boston in getting to our goal of carbon neutrality? And I am going to not answer your question because that's exactly why we've got carbon-free Boston. That is one of the initiatives that we're going to be studying to see how cost-effective it would be to have rooftop solar. Another one of those initiatives was joint purchasing or off-site solar, where you might be able to work not only with the city of Boston, but maybe a host of other cities or businesses that want to do an off-site project that instead of being 60 kilowatts on a rooftop, and even that's pretty large for the city of Boston, maybe you can do 60 megawatts somewhere in North Carolina or somewhere out in Western Mass where you've got cheaper land and you are able to realize the benefits of scale. I think that we'll have to understand what those different cost impacts look like and see how easy it would be for us to do some of those joint purchases versus doing something to make it easier for us to do distributed generation here in the city of Boston. But another one of the things that we're going to be studying through Carbon Free Boston is what can we do to make permitting easier for folks who want to do on-site generation here in the city of Boston. So the short answer is, we want to study it. We want to make sure that we're doing the things that are most cost efficient, and we want to make sure that all of those things are on the table. So the answer will come once we're done with Carbon Free Boston. I want to make sure I heard your question. Were you asking how would the harbor barrier affect the tides and the ecology within Boston Harbor? Okay, perfect. So the short answer is if you look at Boston Harbor right now, we've got all these harbor islands, but we also have all the spaces between it, which allows the tide to come in and the tide to go out. So anything that may work its way into the harbor that's not supposed to be there, whether it's man-made or otherwise, gets a chance to get flowed out as the tide goes out, and then fresh water from the ocean comes back in, and that process gets to repeat. So whether that's waste that's not supposed to be there, or trash, or any discharge from boats or otherwise, that the tide would take that from the inner harbor and eventually carry it out to sea. And if we filled in those gaps between the islands, the tide wouldn't be able to do that as well. Depending on the solution that you have, you might have a gate in a handful of places that would allow for ships to go in and out. But the more that you block those gaps between the harbor islands, the less of that tidal action that you'll get twice a day to flush a lot of that trash or some of the man-made things that would otherwise kind of stagnate in the harbor. So the question is, are you looking at eliminating single-use plastics as part of Zero Waste Boston? The short answer is yeah, it's on the table. Right now our waste stream, single-use plastic bags and plastic bags in general, is less than 1% of our waste stream. Organics are over 30%. So in terms of we could do plastics perfectly and still have 30 times as much opportunity to reduce our waste stream from organics. So are we going to look at it? Absolutely. It's an important debate that's actually ongoing right now. I was talking to the mayor about it earlier today. But when we do Zero Waste Boston, a lot of the solutions are going to really be focused on organics because it is the largest opportunity, followed by construction waste, which shouldn't be in our waste stream, but that's about 25% of our waste stream as well. But we want to make sure that we're doing the things that are relatively easy to do, so potentially like a plastic bag ban, but then also looking at the largest opportunities so that if we're not able to execute on them perfectly, we're still able to have a big impact. Sure, so the question is, what is the city doing to address food waste upstream? And what is the status of Project Oscar, which is the city's pilot on composting, that community composting. It allows people to drop off their food waste at a handful of locations throughout the city of Boston. The short answer on upstream food waste, it's not something that we have traditionally looked at. And I'm not sure how much of the scope of Zero Waste Boston will address it, but it's a big opportunity depending on how you account for greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, we don't do scope 3 emissions. So in other words, looking at how much emissions were created upstream of when something is consumed here in Boston, whether it's a piece of produce or whether it's a car someone buys or otherwise. Those things may have happened in Chile or in China or otherwise. We're really focused. That's very, very difficult to do. For a cup of coffee, for instance, there are 40,000 data points to do scope 3 emissions. It's crazy, right? But if you think about when you do the accounting in that way, then you can say, okay, all the transportation for a coffee bean, all of the fertilizer that went into growing that coffee bean, all of the emissions associated with all of that, and all of a sudden upstream food becomes a pretty big opportunity. We haven't yet cracked the nut, and I think that that's something that as a field, sustainability officers are struggling with, particularly in the municipal context where we don't have a lot of power over the folks who make those decisions as procurement officers for restaurants or cafeterias or otherwise. What we can regulate and what we have seen legislation on is downstream waste. And so that's an opportunity that we're spending time on. Project Oscar, sorry. Short answer, it's an important program. As we do Zero Waste Boston, we want to see whether we should expand it, whether we should end it and replace it with curbside, or take any other action that might be more valuable. So more to say once we're done with Zero Waste Boston. Concrete examples of what we've already done and how do we hold you accountable? How do we make sure that you're delivering on what you said that you were going to do? I would say that some of the things that I talked about already are some of the things that we've already done that have taken quite a bit of effort, right? So not only if you look at our leading cities, what they're doing around sustainability, they've got a chief sustainability officer, they've got a climate action plan, they've got a greenhouse gas inventory. Even if you take those 3 filters, now you're really talking about maybe 20 large cities in the US. If you then put the filter on terms of who is going to the level of effort that we're going to understand the policies and the actions and what the financial consequences and what the benefits are, now you're really talking about 3 cities in the US. So just the fact that we've done that we've updated our climate action plan multiple times, we'll be updating it again, that we're going to have a community process around that. I would say that's concrete steps that we've already taken that make us leaders. The fact that we've also done that we want to lead by example and have this energy savings performance contract, that we want to incentivize the business community and recognize them and give them technical assistance so that we can measure their progress. That's something that I think is concrete progress as well that very few other cities have done. If you look at cities across the nation that have benchmarking ordinances to provide that data so that they can really focus on the buildings who are using 2 or 3 or 4 times the amount of energy that they should have on a per square footage basis, you're talking about, again, just a handful of cities. And we want to make sure that we go above and beyond that. How do you hold me accountable? Make sure that you see in our capital plan that we are doing projects to make the city of Boston more resilient. I mentioned the $2 million that we've already put towards protecting East Boston and Charlestown. If you look at the full plan for East Boston and Charlestown alone, the long-term estimates are over $200 million that we would need to invest either as the city of Boston or through partners to really implement that full plan. Hold me accountable and hold the mayor accountable by the level of investment that we attract to protect those areas, and the level of engagement that we see not only from the city but from our partners at the state, who have been phenomenal partners, and how much federal funding that we're able to attract and how much public-private partnership we're able to attract to implement not only the resiliency side but then also on the adaptation side. Hold us accountable by looking at, as we finish carbon-free Boston in the next year, how we take those recommendations, how we take that information, and how good of a job we do getting it out to all of our businesses and residents to actually form a plan that is not only actionable, but then it can be funded as well. So the short answer is, yes, you can hold me accountable, you can look at the numbers in terms of our emissions and our progress, but make sure that you're looking also at the steps that we are taking that will allow us to make the investments that we need to make as well.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, thank you so much, so much.